They were already calling her a mistake before anyone knew her name. Voices low but sharp as gravel under boots. And in a town like Red Hollow, that was all it took for a life to start slipping through the cracks. Because out here, reputation weighed more than truth, and silence could bury a person deeper than any desert wind ever could. And Clara Whitmore felt that weight in every step as she crossed the main street. Her hands folded tight against her stomach, not from fear alone but from something she refused to let them take from her. Something still small, still quiet, still hers, though no one else seemed willing to believe that. The sun sat high, bleaching color from the wood buildings, turning faces into hard lines and narrowed eyes. And not a single door opened for her anymore. Not the boarding house where she once rented a room. Not the bakery where she used to trade work for bread. Not even the church whose bell still rang every Sunday like forgiveness was something freely given. No. Today it rang hollow, like a reminder she no longer belonged. And when the whispers started again, louder this time, she didn't turn. She didn't defend herself. She just kept walking, boots scraping dust, shoulders straight though her shadow trembled on the ground. Because dignity was the last thing they hadn't taken, and she meant to hold on to it, even if it cost her everything. 3 men leaned against the post outside the general store, watching her pass like she was a story they'd already finished telling. One of them muttered something about shame, another about consequences, and the third just shook his head slow, like disappointment came easier than understanding. Clara kept moving, but the words followed her anyway, clinging like heat, until she reached the edge of town where the road turned rough and the wind carried fewer voices. And that's where she stopped, just for a moment, just long enough to breathe, long enough to close her eyes and remember a time when her name hadn't tasted bitter in other people's mouths, when she had been more than a rumor, more than a warning whispered behind hands. But that memory didn't last, because the sound came then, distant at first, then clearer, steady hoofbeats cutting across the silence like something intentional, something that didn't belong to the noise of the town, but carried its own kind of weight. Clara opened her eyes as the rider came into view, a lone figure against the white stretch of land, moving without hurry, without hesitation, like the road itself had been waiting for him. Ethan Cole, a man the town spoke of in careful tones, not out of fear, but out of something closer to respect that had been earned without asking. A man who kept to himself, who worked hard land a mile outside town and came in only when he had to, who didn't drink, didn't gossip, didn't involve himself in matters that weren't his. And yet as he drew closer, slowing his horse just enough to study her, something shifted in the air, subtle but undeniable. Clara felt it before she understood it. The way stillness can carry meaning when words fall short. Ethan's eyes moved over her, not lingering, not judging, just seeing, really seeing. And for the first time in days, Clara felt something loosen in her chest, something that had been wound tight by every whisper and every closed door. He didn't ask what had happened, didn't demand an explanation. He simply stopped, the horse settling beneath him with a quiet snort, leather creaking in the heat. And for a long second neither of them spoke, because sometimes silence held more truth than anything spoken aloud. And then, from somewhere behind them, carried by the same wind that had brought the whispers, a voice called out again, louder now, meant to be heard, meant to define her before she could define herself. She's with child. And it hung there, heavy, waiting for judgment, waiting for someone to turn away or agree or condemn. Clara's fingers tightened just slightly, her breath catching though she kept her chin level, and Ethan shifted in the saddle, not toward the voice, not toward the town, but toward her, like that was the only direction that mattered. His boots hit the ground with a dull thud as he stepped down, dust rising around him in a slow halo. And when he spoke, it wasn't loud, wasn't meant to carry far, but it did anyway, because of who he was, because of how little he wasted words. Then it's mine, he said, simple as that. No anger, no defense, just a statement placed into the world like a stake driven into dry earth. And the wind seemed to pause, the town behind them going quiet in a way Clara had never heard before, not the quiet of indifference, but the kind that comes when something doesn't fit the story people have already decided to believe. Clara turned to him then, really looked this time, searching for the reason behind words that made no sense. that could cost him everything the same way it had cost her. But his face gave nothing away, no explanation, no regret, just that same steady presence that didn't ask for permission to stand where it chose. And in that moment, standing at the edge of a town that had already cast her out, Clara realized something she hadn't expected, that sometimes the strongest thing a person could do wasn't fight the world or prove it wrong, but simply refuse to step aside. When it tried to push someone else into the dust, and Ethan Cole, a man who owed her nothing, had just chosen not to move, the silence did not break all at once. It cracked slowly, like dry earth under the first drop of rain, one voice at a time returning in hushed disbelief, boots shifting, glances traded, because a man like Ethan Cole did not make claims lightly, and certainly not ones that tied him to trouble. And trouble was exactly what Clara Whitmore had become in the eyes of Red Hollow. Not because of what anyone knew, but because of what they decided was easier to believe. And now that belief had been challenged in the simplest way possible, not with argument, not with anger, but with a sentence that refused to bend. Clara stood there still, her hand hovering near her side, as if unsure where to belong, her breath shallow though she did not show it. Because if she showed it, if she let even a crack appear, the town would fill it with everything they had already decided about her. Ethan did not look back toward the voices, did not acknowledge the shifting weight of judgment behind them. Instead, he reached for the reins, steady, deliberate, then glanced once toward Clara, not as a question, not even as an invitation, just a quiet understanding offered without words. And for a moment she hesitated, because stepping forward meant stepping into something she did not understand, meant trusting a man who had no reason to stand beside her except that he had chosen to. And choices like that did not come easy in a place where survival often meant looking the other way. But staying where she was meant returning to doors that would never open again, meant shrinking under eyes that would never soften. And so she moved, one step at a time, until she reached the horse, Ethan already adjusting the saddle without looking directly at her, giving her space even in proximity, as if he understood that dignity was not restored by closeness but by respect. He offered his hand only when necessary, and even then it was firm, steady, nothing more, nothing less. The ride out of town was quiet, the kind of quiet that carried weight instead of emptiness, wind brushing past them in long, steady strokes, dust trailing behind like a memory neither of them needed to speak about. Clara kept her gaze forward, though she could feel the town watching until the last building disappeared behind them, until Red Hollow became nothing more than a cluster of shapes fading into heat and distance. Ethan's ranch came into view an hour later, set alone against open land, weathered wood, fences worn but standing. Everything about it spoke of persistence rather than comfort, a place built to last, not to impress. He dismounted first, tying the horse with practiced ease, then stepped back, giving Clara time to gather herself before following. She slid down carefully, her boots touching ground that felt different somehow, quieter, like the land itself did not carry judgment the way the town did. Ethan led her toward the house, stopping just short of the door as if remembering something. He reached inside his coat and pulled out a small key, turning it once in his hand before opening the door. The interior was simple, clean, a table, 2 chairs, a bed in the far corner, nothing unnecessary, nothing that asked questions. He stepped aside, letting her enter first, still without speaking. And for the first time since the whispers began, Clara felt something unfamiliar settle in her chest. Not relief, not yet, but space, space to breathe, space to exist without being measured against expectations she had never agreed to. She turned to him then, finally allowing the question that had been building since the edge of town to surface, her voice quiet but steady. Why would you say that? The words hung there, simple, direct, carrying more than curiosity, carrying the weight of everything he had just placed on himself. Ethan paused, his hand resting briefly on the back of the chair, his gaze lowering for a fraction of a second, as if considering something he rarely allowed himself to consider. Then he looked at her again, the same calm, the same steadiness, but now with something deeper beneath it, something that did not ask for recognition. Because someone should, he said, and that was all. No explanation, no story, just a truth offered without decoration. Clara studied him, searching for more, for anything that might explain the choice, but found only that same quiet resolve. And in that moment she realized something else, that whatever reason he carried, it was not about proving anything to the town. It was not about fixing her situation or claiming ownership over her future. It was about standing where others would not. And sometimes that was the difference between being alone and not. Outside, the wind moved through the fence posts with a low, steady hum, like the land itself acknowledging a shift that had already begun. And though neither of them spoke again that evening, the silence no longer felt like something closing in. It felt like something waiting, something that had not yet revealed its full shape. And somewhere far behind them, in a town that believed it had already written Clara Whitmore's ending, the story had just begun to change in a way none of them could see coming. Morning came slow over Ethan Cole's ranch, not with noise, but with light creeping across the worn wood floor, stretching long through the window like it had all the time in the world. And Clara Whitmore woke before the sun fully settled, not because she had rested well, but because her body had learned to expect interruption, learned that peace rarely lasted long enough to trust it. She lay still for a moment, listening, expecting whispers, footsteps, the weight of judgment pressing through walls that had never kept anything out before. But there was nothing, just wind brushing against the house, the distant creak of fence posts, and somewhere outside, the soft rhythm of movement, steady, predictable, human. She rose slowly, careful with each motion, the small ache in her body reminding her of everything she carried, not just the child, but the days behind her that refused to fade. Quietly, she stepped to the window and saw him, Ethan, already at work, sleeves rolled, moving along the fence line with measured purpose, hammer in hand, fixing what time and weather had worn down, as if nothing else in the world demanded his attention, as if yesterday had not shifted the ground beneath both of them. And yet there was something different in the way he moved, not distracted, not burdened, just aware, like a man who had accepted the weight of a decision and chose to carry it without complaint. Clara watched for a while, longer than she meant to, studying the rhythm of his work, the way he paused to check each post before moving on, the way he did not rush even though there was always more to be done. And she realized that nothing about him felt accidental, not even the words he had spoken, especially not those words. She turned from the window when the quiet inside the room began to feel too large, too empty, and stepped into the main space. The table still held the same two chairs, the same simplicity, but now it felt less like absence and more like intention. She reached for a cup near the edge, hesitated, then set it back, unsure what was hers to take, unsure what boundaries still existed in a place where she had been given shelter without condition. The door opened then, not abruptly, not with force, just enough to let the morning air slip inside before Ethan stepped through, his hat in one hand, dust clinging lightly to his boots. He paused when he saw her standing there, not surprised, not unsettled, just acknowledging her presence the same way he acknowledged everything else, without judgment. He moved to the table, set down a small cloth bundle, and pushed it slightly toward her. Bread. Simple, still warm enough to carry a faint scent that filled the room. Clara looked at it, then at him, the question forming again, not about food this time, but about everything, about the quiet, about the space he gave her, about the choice he had made without asking anything in return. You do not have to keep doing this, she said, her voice softer than she intended, as if speaking too loudly might disturb something fragile. Ethan leaned back slightly against the table, arms loose at his sides, considering her words with the same patience he gave his work. Doing what? He asked, not dismissive, not defensive, just precise. Clara gestured lightly, not just at the bread, but at the room, the ranch, the invisible line he had drawn between her and the world outside. Standing in front of something that is not yours, she said, and there it was, the truth beneath everything, the line she thought he might finally step away from. Ethan's gaze held hers for a moment longer than before, not searching, not demanding, just steady. Then he shook his head once, small, certain. That is where you are wrong, he said, and the words settled heavier than anything spoken the day before. Clara felt it, the shift, not in the room, but in herself, because there was no claim in his voice, no ownership, only responsibility. Something chosen, not taken, something that did not need permission to exist. Outside, the wind picked up slightly, brushing against the walls with a low, constant sound. And for the first time since she had crossed into this place, Clara did not feel like she was standing at the edge of something uncertain. She felt like she had stepped into something that had already begun long before she arrived, something that did not ask who she had been, only who she would be allowed to become. And though she still did not understand Ethan Cole, did not know what shaped a man to speak the way he had, she understood one thing clearly, that whatever was coming next would not be decided by the voices in red hollow, because here, in this quiet stretch of land, those voices no longer carried the same weight. And somewhere far beyond the fence line, a rider moved along the distant ridge, small against the horizon, unnoticed for now, but closing the distance with every step, carrying with him a past that had not yet finished with Clara Whitmore. The rider on the ridge did not rush, and that was what made him dangerous in a way Clara could not yet name, because men who carried urgency often made mistakes, but men who moved with patience had already decided how things would unfold long before they arrived. And Ethan Cole noticed him before Clara ever turned her head, not because he was looking for trouble, but because he had learned that trouble rarely announced itself loudly. It appeared quiet, distant, and steady, like a shadow that did not belong to the land. Ethan set the hammer down beside the fence post, not abruptly, not with alarm, just enough to free his hands, his eyes narrowing slightly against the sunlight as he measured distance, pace, intention. The rider was still more than half a mile out, a small figure against the pale stretch of earth, but something about the way the horse moved, the way the man sat upright without sway, told Ethan this was no wanderer, no lost traveler. This was someone who knew exactly where he was going. Inside the house, Clara felt the shift before she understood it. The quiet outside changed, not in sound but in weight, like the air itself had drawn a breath and held it. She stepped toward the doorway, her hand brushing the frame as she looked out, following Ethan's line of sight until she saw it too, that distant shape growing slowly, steadily, and something inside her tightened, not fear in the way the town had taught her, not shame, but recognition, the kind that does not need confirmation to feel real. Her fingers moved instinctively to the chain at her neck, the small silver piece she had kept hidden beneath her collar, the only thing she had not been forced to leave behind. And as the rider came closer, the sunlight caught that chain for just a second, a brief flash that seemed insignificant, but not to her, never to her. Ethan glanced back once, just enough to see Clara standing in the doorway, her posture no longer uncertain, no longer searching, but still, too still, like someone bracing for something already decided. He did not ask her what she saw, did not question the change in her expression. Instead, he stepped forward, placing himself slightly ahead of her position without making it obvious, not shielding, not controlling, just present. The rider closed the distance slowly until the sound of hoofbeats reached them clear and measured, 10 yards, then 5, then none. The horse stopped with a soft exhale, dust settling around its legs. The man remained seated for a moment longer than necessary, as if deciding whether the ground deserved his attention. Then he dismounted, boots hitting the earth with a controlled heaviness. His coat was clean, his hat unmarked. Everything about him suggested a life untouched by the rough edges that shaped men like Ethan, and yet his eyes moved with precision, scanning the ranch, the fence line, the house, and finally, Clara. And when they settled on her, something shifted, subtle but unmistakable. Recognition passed between them like a current that needed no words. Clara's breath caught, just once, small enough that most would miss it, but Ethan did not. He felt it the way he felt changes in the wind before a storm. The man stepped forward, not hurried, not hesitant, and when he spoke, his voice carried the smoothness of someone used to being heard, without needing to raise it. "I was told I might find you here," he said, not to Ethan, not to the land, but directly to Clara, and there was no accusation in it, no warmth either, just certainty. Clara did not answer right away, her hand still resting lightly over the chain, her eyes steady though something deeper moved beneath them, something older than the past few days. Ethan shifted slightly, just enough to place himself between the man and the doorway, not blocking, not provoking, simply existing in that space where lines are drawn without being spoken. The man's gaze flickered to Ethan then, taking in the stance, the silence, the refusal to move aside, and for the first time, a faint change touched his expression, not anger, not surprise, but interest, like he had encountered something he had not planned for, something that did not fit the pattern he was used to controlling. Clara finally spoke then, her voice quiet but clear. "You should not be here," she said, and the words did not carry fear. They carried distance, the kind that comes from knowing exactly who stands in front of you and choosing not to step closer. The man tilted his head slightly, considering her, then glanced once more at the chain at her neck, the smallest detail. "But enough, that is not your decision to make," he replied, still calm, still certain, and in that moment, the air between them tightened, not with threat, but with something heavier, something waiting to surface, and Ethan Cole, standing in the space he had chosen days ago, understood without needing explanation that whatever this man carried with him, it was not finished, and neither was Clara Whitmore's story, not by a long shot. The wind did not move when the three of them stood there. It only waited, pressing against the stillness like it knew something was about to be decided without ever being spoken aloud. Ethan Cole did not shift his ground, not forward, not back, just enough to remain where he had chosen to stand, between Clara and the man who had arrived carrying a past that refused to stay buried. The stranger studied him now with more care, not dismissing him the way men like him usually dismissed others, but measuring, calculating, as if Ethan's silence said more than any challenge could. Clara felt that gaze without turning, her fingers still resting over the chain beneath her collar, the small weight of it suddenly heavier than it had ever been. Because it was no longer just a memory, it was a bridge, one that had now been crossed without her consent. The man took another step forward, slow, deliberate, stopping just short of the line Ethan had drawn without words. His boots settled into the dust, as if he expected the ground itself to acknowledge him. "You left without saying a word," he said, and now his tone carried something else, not anger, not quite, but a trace of something closer to ownership, something that did not belong in Clara's world anymore. Clara's shoulders straightened slightly, not in defense, but in refusal. "I said enough," she replied, her voice steady though her pulse moved faster beneath the surface. Ethan did not look at her, did not need to. He could hear the difference, the strength that had not been there when she first arrived, the strength that had grown in the space he had given her without asking anything in return. The man's eyes flickered again to the chain, that same small detail pulling his attention like a thread that could unravel everything if pulled hard enough. "You kept it," he said, softer now, almost thoughtful, and that was when Clara's hand dropped from her collar, not hiding it anymore, not protecting it, but letting it rest where it could be seen, the silver catching the light once more, clear, undeniable. "It was never yours to take," she said, and the words landed differently than anything she had spoken before, not defensive, not explaining, but claiming something that had always been hers even when she had not known how to hold on to it. The man's expression changed then, just enough for Ethan to notice, the calm certainty bending for the first time, replaced by something sharper, not outward, not aggressive, but internal, like a plan adjusting itself in real time. "You misunderstand," he said, and there it was, the shift from statement to persuasion, from certainty to control. "Everything that happened, it was not meant to harm you." The words were smooth, practiced, shaped to sound like reason, but Clara did not move, did not react the way he expected, because she had heard those words before, in a different place, under a different sky, and she had believed them once. The memory passed through her like a shadow, but it did not settle, it did not take hold the way it used to, because now there was something else in its place, something steadier, something that did not bend under the weight of someone else's version of truth. "Intent does not change what was done," she said quietly, and Ethan felt it again, that shift, not in the air, not in the land, but in the balance between them. The man went still for a moment, not because he had run out of words, but because the ones he had were no longer working the way they always had. His gaze moved once more to Ethan, lingering there longer this time, as if trying to understand the part of the equation he had not accounted for. "And you," he said finally, addressing Ethan directly for the first time. "You believe this concerns you?" Ethan met his gaze without hesitation, without challenge, just presence. It does now, he replied, simple, unadorned, but final. And that was the moment the line became real, not drawn in dust, not imagined, but set. The man exhaled slowly, his posture relaxing just slightly, but not in surrender, not in retreat. More like someone who had decided to step back not because he had been stopped, but because he had learned enough for now. This is not finished, he said, not as a threat, not as a warning, but as a fact he intended to return to. He turned then, mounting his horse with the same controlled ease he had arrived with. And as he rode away, the distance between them growing one steady step at a time, the air seemed to move again, the wind returning to its slow, constant rhythm. Clara did not watch him leave. She did not need to. She knew what he carried with him, and she knew it would come back. The question was not if, but how. Ethan remained where he was for a moment longer, eyes following the rider until he disappeared beyond the rise. Then he turned slightly, not fully, just enough to acknowledge Clara's presence again, and in that quiet space between them, something unspoken settled into place. Not safety, not yet, but understanding, the kind that does not need explanation to exist, because out here, in the open stretch of land where nothing could be hidden for long, the truth had already begun to surface, and neither of them could step away from it now. The dust settled long after the rider disappeared, but the feeling he left behind did not move with it. It stayed quiet and heavy, like a storm that had not yet decided when to break. Ethan Cole stood a moment longer than necessary, not watching the horizon anymore, but listening, not for sound, but for change. And when he finally turned back toward the house, Clara Whitmore had not moved from where she stood, her posture still, her gaze lowered now, not in fear, but in thought, like someone sorting through pieces that no longer fit the way they once did. Ethan walked past her without a word, not ignoring her, not dismissing her, but giving her the same space he always had. Because some truths needed room before they could be spoken, he stepped inside, setting a fresh cup on the table, pouring water with steady hands. The simple act grounding the moment in something real, something that did not shift with memory or consequence. Clara followed a few seconds later, slower, more deliberate, as if crossing the threshold now meant something different than it had before. She closed the door behind her, the soft click echoing just enough to mark a line between what had been outside and what remained inside. She did not sit, did not reach for the table. Instead, she stood near the window again, her reflection faint against the glass, her hand once more finding the chain at her neck, not hiding it this time, but holding it like a question she had avoided asking for too long. Ethan did not look at her right away. He finished what he was doing first, setting the cup down where she could take it if she chose. Then leaning lightly against the edge of the table, his eyes steady but patient, Clara spoke without turning, her voice low but clear. He will come back. And it was not a guess, not a fear, it was knowledge. Ethan nodded once, small, acknowledging what had already been decided without needing to say it aloud. Then we will be here, he replied, and the words did not carry bravado, did not promise more than they could hold. They simply existed, grounded and certain. Clara let out a breath she had not realized she was holding, but it did not bring relief, not entirely, because the question that followed was not about him, not about the man who had ridden away, but about herself, about the part of the story she had never spoken out loud, not even to herself. She turned then, slowly, facing Ethan fully for the first time since the rider had arrived, her eyes searching his not for answers, but for something steadier, something she could anchor to. You should know, she said, and the words carried weight, not hesitation, but consequence. Ethan did not interrupt, did not ask what she meant. He simply waited, the same way he had waited through everything else, giving the moment the space it required. Clara's fingers tightened slightly around the chain before she let it fall free, the silver catching the light again, no longer hidden, no longer protected by silence. That chain, she continued, her voice steady though something deeper moved beneath it. It was given to me the night everything changed. The room seemed to hold that sentence in place, not expanding, not collapsing, just allowing it to exist. I believed what he told me then, she added, not as an excuse, not as a defense, but as a truth she no longer needed to hide from. Ethan's expression did not change, not because he did not understand, but because he did not judge, and that absence of judgment was what made it possible for her to continue. I believed it was something good, she said, and now there was a shift, subtle, but real, the past no longer controlling the way she spoke about it, until it was not. The words settled into the space between them, not loud, not dramatic, just final in their simplicity. Ethan straightened slightly, not moving closer, not reaching out, but present in a way that did not require action. And now, he said, his voice as steady as before, it is something else. Clara looked at him then, really looked, searching for what he meant, and in that moment she understood, not fully, not all at once, but enough, that what had once been a symbol of something taken could become something reclaimed, not because the past changed, but because she did. Outside, the wind shifted direction, moving across the land in a new pattern, subtle but undeniable, and Clara felt it, not just in the air, but in herself, the way something long held in place had begun to loosen, not fall apart, but change shape. And for the first time since the rider had appeared, the future did not feel like something closing in. It felt like something approaching, something that would demand more than silence, more than survival, something that would require her to stand not just beside Ethan Cole, but on her own. And though neither of them spoke again for a while, the quiet that followed was not the same as before. It was no longer waiting for something to happen. It was preparing for it. The next morning did not arrive gently. It came with a sharper light, cutting across the land as if the sky itself had decided there would be no more hiding. And Clara Whitmore stepped outside before Ethan. Cole had even returned from the far fence line, the air cooler than the day before, carrying a faint shift that only those who listened closely could feel. She stood there for a long moment, one hand resting lightly against her side, the other hanging loose, no longer reaching for the chain as often, as if the weight of it had begun to settle into something she could carry without thinking. The land stretched out in every direction, open, honest, nothing concealed, and for the first time she understood why Ethan had chosen this place, not because it was easy, but because it left no room for anything false to survive. She walked slowly toward the edge of the yard, her boots pressing into the dry earth, each step deliberate, not wandering, not lost, but moving with a quiet intention she had not felt in days, maybe longer. And when Ethan came into view from the west side of the property, she did not turn away this time, did not wait for him to close the distance first. She met him, halfway. Something small, something simple, but different. He noticed it without showing that he noticed, just adjusting his pace slightly, enough to meet her where she chose to stand, not where he expected her to be. "You are up early," he said, his voice carrying the same calm as always. But there was a trace of something else now, not concern, not surprise, but awareness. Clara nodded once, glancing briefly toward the ridge where the rider had appeared the day before, the horizon empty now, but not forgotten. "I do not think he will wait long," she said, and there was no fear in it, only readiness. Ethan followed her gaze for a second, then looked back at her, measuring not the land this time, but her, the way she stood, the way her shoulders held steady even as the future pressed closer. "Then neither will we," he replied, and again, no promise beyond what could be kept, just presence, just truth. Clara studied him for a moment, longer than before, as if trying to understand the kind of man who did not need to raise his voice to be heard, who did not need to prove anything to anyone standing in front of him. And she realized something she had not allowed herself to consider until now, that Ethan Cole was not standing beside her because he believed her story. He was standing beside her because he believed she deserved to tell it. And that difference mattered more than anything else. She turned slightly, looking back toward the house, then to the open land beyond, her hand lifting once more, but instead of gripping the chain, she let it rest, visible now against the light fabric of her dress, no longer hidden, no longer something to protect, but something to present. "If he returns," she said slowly, choosing each word with care, "I will not stand behind you." Ethan did not react immediately, did not interrupt the space she was claiming, and when he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than before, not softer, but deeper. "I did not bring you here to stand behind me," he said, and the words settled into her like something steady, something that did not shift with circumstance. Clara nodded once, small, but certain, because she understood now. Not everything. Not yet. But enough. Enough to know that what came next would not be decided by silence, would not be shaped by whispers carried through town streets. It would be shaped here, in the open, where nothing could be hidden. The wind moved again, stronger this time, brushing past them with a low, steady sound. And somewhere far off, too far to be seen clearly, a faint line of dust began to rise along the ridge, subtle, almost easy to miss. But not to Ethan, and not to Clara. They both saw it at the same time, not turning to each other, not needing to confirm it. Because some things did not require words. The past was not waiting anymore. It was coming. And this time, Clara Whitmore did not step back. She stood where she was, shoulders steady, eyes forward. And for the first time since the whispers had begun, the story did not feel like something happening to her. It felt like something she was ready to face. The dust on the ridge did not rise in a hurry. It gathered slow, deliberate, like something that had taken its time, choosing the moment to be seen. And Clara Whitmore stood still as it formed, her eyes fixed on that thin line where sky met earth, no longer searching for confirmation, no longer hoping it might be something else, because she already knew. Ethan Cole shifted slightly beside her, not stepping in front, not stepping back, just aligning himself with the moment as it came, his gaze narrowing just enough to measure distance, speed, number, the way a man does when he has learned that knowing too late costs more than knowing early ever will. The wind moved across the land again, stronger now, carrying the faint rhythm of hoofbeats before they were fully heard, and Clara felt it in her chest. Not fear, not panic, but something steadier, something that had taken root since she crossed into this place. She did not reach for the door, did not retreat to the safety of walls that could not hold what was coming anyway. Instead, she stepped forward, one pace, then another, until she stood just ahead of where she had been before, not by much, but enough to change the shape of the moment. Ethan noticed. Of course he did, but he did not comment, did not stop her, because this was not a step she needed permission to take. The rider came into view soon after, clearer now. The same man. The same posture, the same controlled pace that spoke of decisions already made. But this time he was not alone. Two more figures followed at a measured distance behind him, not close enough to crowd, not far enough to be separate. And that told Ethan everything he needed to know. Not a show of force, not a threat, but a statement, something meant to be seen, meant to be understood. Without being spoken aloud, Clara's eyes tracked them without flinching, her breathing steady, her hand resting lightly at her side, no longer guarding the chain, no longer hiding anything. The three riders closed the distance until they reached the edge of the yard, stopping in a loose line that felt practiced without being rigid. The lead man dismounted first, just as before, but this time his attention did not move around the ranch. It stayed on Clara, as if everything else had already been accounted for. "You have had time to reconsider," he said, his voice carrying the same smooth control, but now with a trace of expectation beneath it. Not a question, not quite, more like a conclusion. He had already reached. Clara did not answer immediately. She let the silence sit between them, let it stretch just long enough to make it clear that this moment would not move at his pace. Ethan stood to her side, not ahead, not behind, exactly where he had been when she stepped forward. And that was the difference now. She was not being shielded. She was being accompanied. Clara lifted her chin slightly, meeting the man's gaze without hesitation. "I have," she said, simple, direct, and for a brief second, something shifted in the man's expression, not doubt, not yet, but the awareness that the conversation he expected was not the one he was about to have. He glanced once at Ethan, measuring again, then back to Clara. "Then you understand what must be done," he continued, still calm, still certain, but now watching more closely. Clara's hand moved then, not to hide, not to protect, but to draw the chain fully into the light, letting it rest openly against her dress where it could not be ignored. The silver caught the sun again, brighter this time, unmistakable. "Yes," she said, and there was no hesitation now, no uncertainty left to shape her voice. "I understand that it ends here." The words landed clean, not loud, not forceful, but final in a way that did not invite negotiation. The men behind him shifted slightly in their saddles, not reacting, not interrupting, just acknowledging that something had changed in the space between them. The lead man's gaze sharpened, focusing on the chain, on the way she held it now, not as something given, but as something claimed. "You are making a mistake," he said, and this time there was a hint of something beneath the control. Something closer to urgency, subtle, but present. Clara shook her head once, small but certain. "No," she replied, her voice steady, grounded in something that did not come from him. "I am correcting one." And that was when the air shifted again, not with sound, not with movement, but with meaning, because this was no longer about what had happened before. It was about what would be allowed to continue. Ethan did not move, did not speak, but his presence held, firm and quiet, like the land itself refusing to give way. The man exhaled slowly, his posture adjusting just slightly, as if recalculating, as if the path he had expected had closed without warning. And for the first time since he arrived, the certainty in his stance did not look unshakable. It looked tested, and Clara Whitmore, standing in the open with nothing left to hide, did not step back, not even an inch, because whatever came next would not be decided by the past he carried with him. It would be decided by the truth. She was finally ready to stand in front of the words did not echo. They settled, heavy and still, as if the land itself had chosen to hold them in place. And for a moment no one moved. Not the men on horseback, not Ethan Cole, not even the wind that had been pushing steadily across the plain just seconds before. Clara Whitmore stood with her shoulders squared, the silver chain catching light at her collar, no longer a secret, no longer something shaped by someone else's story, and the man in front of her studied that change with careful precision, not reacting the way he once would have, not dismissing her as someone who could be guided back into silence, because now she stood differently, spoke differently, and most importantly, refused to bend. "You believe standing here changes what has already been decided," he said after a pause, his voice still smooth, but the certainty now carried a slight edge, like something tested and found not as firm as before. Clara did not look away, did not search for Ethan beside her, because she no longer needed to borrow strength from where she stood. "No," she replied, her tone calm, measured, grounded. "I believe it reveals what was never yours to decide." The words did not rise, did not challenge, they simply existed, and that was enough to shift the balance again. One of the riders behind the man adjusted slightly in his saddle, not in threat, but in awareness, as if the ground beneath this conversation had become less certain than it appeared. Ethan remained where he was, silent, his presence unchanged, but his attention sharp, following every small shift, every glance, every breath that might signal what came next, because he understood something the others did not, that this moment was not about force, it was about truth, and truth did not arrive loudly. It settled slowly until it could not be ignored. The man's eyes returned once more to the chain, lingering longer now, and there was something different in that look, not recognition alone, but calculation, the kind that comes when a piece thought controlled reveals itself to be something else entirely. "You think that changes anything," he said quietly, almost to himself, and Clara took a step forward, not far, not aggressive, just enough to make the distance between them hers to measure. "It changes everything," she answered, and this time her voice carried more than steadiness. It carried clarity, the kind that comes after a long silence finally breaks. The man's posture shifted again, subtle but real, his shoulders no longer resting in complete ease, his stance adjusting as if the ground beneath him required more attention than before. "You are choosing to make this difficult," he said, and now the words were no longer an observation. They were a warning dressed in calm. Clara did not flinch, did not step back. "No," she said again, and this time there was no pause, no space left for misinterpretation. "I am choosing not to make it easy for you anymore." The statement landed without force, but with weight, and for the first time since he arrived. The man did not respond immediately. The silence stretched again, but it was different. Now, not controlled by him, not shaped by expectation, but shared, balanced, uncertain. Ethan's gaze moved briefly to Clara, not checking, not questioning, but acknowledging what she had just done, the line she had drawn without needing his protection to hold it. The wind returned then, slow at first, then steady, brushing across the land as if the moment had been released, as if something held in place had finally shifted enough to allow movement again. The man exhaled slowly, his eyes lifting from the chain to Clara's face, studying her one last time, not with dismissal, not with ownership, but with something closer to recognition, not of what she had been, but of what she had become. This will not end. The way you think, he said finally, his voice quieter now, less certain. Though he would never admit it, Clara did not answer right away. She let the words settle, let them pass without taking hold, because she understood now that endings were not something he decided. They were something she would face on her own terms. It already has, she said, and the simplicity of it carried more weight than anything else spoken that day. The riders behind him remained still, watching, waiting, but not moving forward, because whatever had brought them here had already changed shape. The man turned slightly then, not fully retreating, not conceding, but stepping back just enough to break the line he had tried to hold. And in that small movement, everything became clear. This was no longer a matter of control. It was a matter of what could no longer be taken. Ethan remained steady, saying nothing, doing nothing, because nothing more was needed. Clara Whitmore stood where she was, not hidden, not shielded. And for the first time since this story began, she was not being defined by what had been done to her. She was defining what would happen next, and out here, under a sky that held no secrets. That was the only truth that mattered. The distance between them did not close again. It held, stretched thin like a line that had already been tested and would not be crossed the same way twice. And the man standing before Clara Whitmore understood that now, not fully, not comfortably, but enough to know that whatever control he once believed he carried had slipped beyond his reach. He adjusted his gloves slowly, deliberately, buying time not for words but for thought, because men like him did not retreat without first deciding what the next move would be. And yet the ground beneath him no longer belonged to that certainty. The ranch, the open sky, the quiet presence of Ethan Cole standing without challenge yet without yielding, all of it worked against the pattern he had relied on. Clara did not move, her hand no longer touching the chain, no longer needing its weight to remind her of anything, because what it represented had already shifted inside her, from something given to something reclaimed. The wind brushed across her dress, lifting the fabric just slightly, carrying the faint scent of dust and sun-warmed earth, grounding her in a place where nothing could be hidden. The man glanced once more at the riders behind him, not for permission, not for support, but to measure how this moment would be seen, how it would be remembered, because reputation did not just belong to towns like Red Hollow. It followed men like him as well. And this was not how such moments were meant to end. You are choosing a harder road than necessary, he said finally, his voice quieter now, stripped of the smooth certainty that had carried him here. And Clara met his gaze without hesitation. No, she replied, her tone unchanged, steady, certain. I am choosing the only road that is mine. The words settled deeper than anything before, not because they were louder, but because they left no space for negotiation. Ethan shifted his weight slightly, not stepping forward, not stepping back, simply grounding himself further into the moment, his silence still unbroken, his presence still unwavering. The man exhaled slowly, a breath that carried more than the air itself. It carried the recognition that this conversation had reached its end, not by force, not by agreement, but by something far more difficult to undo, truth that refused to bend. He looked at Clara one last time, not with ownership, not even with challenge, but with something closer to acceptance. Reluctant, incomplete, but real enough to change what came next. Then you will face what follows, he said, not as a threat, but as a fact he could not reshape. Clara nodded once, small, deliberate. I will, she answered, and there was no fear in it, no hesitation, only readiness, the kind that did not come from knowing the outcome, but from no longer avoiding it. The man turned then, mounting his horse with less ceremony than before, less control in the movement. Though most would not notice, the two riders behind him followed without question, the three of them forming that same loose line as they began to move away. But this time the space between them felt different, less certain, less fixed, as if something fundamental had shifted in the direction they would take from here. Clara watched them go, not tracking every step, not holding on to their retreat, but acknowledging it, letting it pass without pulling her back into what had already been decided. Ethan remained beside her, not speaking, not interrupting the quiet that followed, because he understood that some moments did not need to be filled, they needed to settle. To find their place in what came next, the dust rose again under the horse's hooves, but it did not linger the same way. It moved with the wind, carried away across the open land, leaving the space clear, open, unchanged, and yet entirely different. Clara let out a slow breath, her shoulders easing just slightly, not from relief, but from release. Something she had carried for too long had finally shifted, not gone, not erased, but no longer holding her in place. She turned then, not toward the house, not toward the past, but toward the wide stretch of land ahead. And for the first time, she did not feel like she was standing at the edge of something uncertain. She felt like she was standing at the beginning of something she would shape herself. Ethan glanced at her briefly, just enough to see that change, that quiet strength that had not been there when she first arrived. And though he said nothing, did nothing more than remain where he was, the meaning was clear. He had never intended to carry her story for her, only to stand where others would not, until she could stand there herself. And now she did, not behind him, not hidden, but beside him, equal in the space they shared. The wind moved across the land again, steady, constant, and somewhere far beyond the ridge, beyond sight and sound. The story that had tried to define Clara Whitmore was no longer the one that would decide how it ended, because out here, under a sky that kept no secrets, the only thing that remained was what she chose to carry forward, and that choice had already been made. The land did not change after they left, not in any way a man could point to. The fences still leaned where they always had. The wind still crossed the plains with that same steady patience, and the house behind them still stood quiet against the open sky. But something had shifted, not outside, not in the things that could be seen, but in the space Clara Whitmore now occupied within it. She no longer stood as someone passing through, no longer waiting for the next thing to happen to her. She stood as someone who had already faced what was coming and chosen not to step aside. Ethan Cole moved back toward the fence line without a word, picking up the hammer where he had left it, not because the work mattered more than what had just happened, but because it mattered the same, because life did not stop for moments like that. It continued, steady and unyielding, and the way a person stepped back into it said more than anything spoken during the storm itself. Clara watched him for a moment, not with the same uncertainty as before, not trying to understand why he stayed or what he expected in return, but with a quiet recognition, the kind that does not need explanation to feel true. She turned then, walking slowly toward the house, each step measured, not heavy, not hesitant, just deliberate. The door opened with that same soft sound as before, the inside unchanged, simple, still, but now it felt different, not empty, not borrowed, but shared. She moved to the table, resting her fingers lightly against its surface, grounding herself in something solid, something that did not shift with memory or fear. The chain at her neck caught the light again, and this time she did not look away from it, did not turn it inward or hide it beneath fabric. She let it remain where it was, visible, honest, a part of her story that no longer needed to be concealed. Outside, Ethan worked through the next section of fence, each strike of the hammer steady, consistent, the rhythm carrying across the yard like a heartbeat that refused to falter, and Clara found herself listening to it, not as noise, but as something reassuring, something that existed regardless of what had come or what might still come. She stepped back outside after a while, not called, not needed, just choosing to be there. The sun had climbed higher now, the light stronger, casting fewer shadows, and for the first time since she had arrived, Clara did not feel like she was standing in one. She moved toward Ethan, stopping a few feet away, not interrupting his work, just present, and after a moment he paused, not because he had to, but because he chose to, resting the hammer against the post, his gaze shifting briefly toward her. "They will not stop entirely," he said, not as a warning, not as doubt, but as truth. Clara nodded once, her expression unchanged. "No," she replied, "but they will not decide for me again." The words carried no weight of defiance, no need to prove anything. They simply existed as fact, Ethan studied her for a second longer, then gave a small nod of his own. Not agreement, not approval, but acknowledgement, the kind that comes when two people stand on the same ground without needing to claim it. The wind moved again, softer now, brushing past them without urgency. And for a moment the world felt still in a different way, not waiting, not holding its breath, but settled, as if something long unsettled had finally found its place. Clara looked out across the land, the horizon stretching wide and open, and she realized that nothing about what had happened would disappear, not the past, not the man who had ridden away, not the whispers that would likely follow in other forms, but none of it held her the same way anymore. None of it defined where she stood or what she would become. She placed a hand lightly against her side, not out of fear, not out of uncertainty, but as a quiet reminder of what she carried forward, something that would not be shaped by anyone else's claim or denial, something that would belong to her alone. Ethan picked up the hammer again, returning to the work without another word, and Clara did not need anything more than that, because out here, under a sky that offered no shelter from truth, the only thing that mattered was the choice to remain standing, and that choice, once made, did not need to be spoken again. It simply needed to be lived. The days that followed did not announce themselves with change. They moved quietly, almost unnoticed, like the steady turning of seasons that reshaped the land without asking permission. And Clara Whitmore learned that peace was not the absence of conflict. It was the ability to stand without it owning you. She moved through the ranch with a rhythm that began to mirror Ethan Cole's, not copying, not following, but finding her own pace within the same open space. Mornings came with the same light stretching across the floor, the same wind brushing past the windows. And yet each one felt different because she no longer woke expecting to be pushed aside. She woke knowing she had a place to stand. Ethan did not speak much, not because he had nothing to say, but because what needed to be understood had already been made clear. His actions remained the same, steady, consistent, grounded, the kind of presence that did not shift with pressure, and Clara found that she no longer searched for reasons behind it. She accepted it for what it was, something real, something that did not need explanation to exist. The town of Red Hollow remained distant, but not silent. News traveled in ways the wind could not carry, passing from one voice to another until it reached even the edges of places like this. And Clara knew they were speaking her name again, not with the same certainty, not with the same confidence, because something had changed in the story they told. Something no longer fit the version they had chosen before. She did not need to hear the words to understand it. She felt it in the absence of weight that once pressed against her, the absence of fear that once shaped every step. One afternoon, as the sun dipped lower and cast long shadows across the land, Clara stood near the fence line Ethan had repaired days before, running her fingers lightly along the wood, feeling the solidness of something that had been broken and made whole again, not erased, not replaced, but strengthened where it had once been weak. She paused there, her gaze moving out across the horizon, and for a moment she thought of the man who had come and gone, the certainty he carried, the way it had cracked when faced with something he could not control. She did not wonder if he would return. She already knew the answer, but the question no longer held power over her. It no longer shaped what she would do or how she would stand, because that had already been decided. Ethan approached then, his steps quiet against the earth, stopping a few feet away as he often did, never crowding, never assuming. "Fence will hold," he said, not as reassurance, but as fact. Clara nodded, her hand still resting on the wood. "So will I," she replied, and the simplicity of it carried more weight than any explanation could. Ethan's gaze lingered for a moment, not questioning, not doubting, just recognizing the truth in her words, the kind of truth that does not need to be tested to be believed. The wind shifted again, carrying a cooler edge now, a reminder that time did not stop, that the world beyond this place continued to move, to change, to bring new moments that would ask new things of those who stood within it. Clara turned from the fence, her posture steady, her expression calm. And for the first time since she had stepped onto this land, there was no trace of hesitation in her movement, no pause before the next step. She walked back toward the house, not seeking shelter, but simply continuing forward, and Ethan followed a moment later, not because she needed him to, but because that was where he was meant to be, not in front, not behind, but alongside. The sun dipped lower still, casting the land in a softer light, the edges of everything less harsh, less defined. And in that quiet transition between day and night, Clara Whitmore understood something that had taken her longer than she expected to learn. That strength was not found in resisting every force that came against you. It was found in knowing which ones no longer deserved your attention, which ones no longer had the right to shape who you became. And as the light faded and the first hint of evening settled across the ranch, the story that had once tried to define her no longer held that power, not because it had disappeared, but because she had stepped beyond it. And in that space, open and unclaimed, she had begun to write something new. The night settled over the ranch without ceremony, no grand arrival, just a slow fading of light until the land softened into shadow and the sky stretched wide with quiet stars. And Clara Whitmore stood on the porch, her hand resting lightly against the wooden rail, feeling the grain beneath her fingers, solid, real, unchanged by everything that had come and gone. The wind moved gentler now, carrying the cool edge of evening, brushing past her without urgency. And for a moment she simply stood there, breathing, not thinking of what had been said or what might still come, just standing, present in a way she had not allowed herself to be for a long time. Behind her, inside the house, a small lamp cast a warm glow across the table. The same table that had once felt borrowed, temporary, now part of something steady, something she no longer questioned. Ethan Cole stepped out a moment later, closing the door softly behind him, not interrupting the quiet, just joining it. He stood beside her, not close, not distant, exactly where he had always chosen to be. And neither of them spoke at first, because words were no longer needed to fill the space between them. The land stretched out before them, endless in its openness, and Clara's gaze followed it, not searching, not expecting, just seeing, truly seeing what was there instead of what she feared might be. "It is quieter now," she said after a while, her voice low, almost blending into the wind itself. Ethan nodded once, his eyes still on the horizon. "It usually is," he replied, and there was something in the way he said it, not just about the land, but about everything, about how storms pass, how noise fades, how what remains is what was always meant to stay. Clara let those words settle, not analyzing them, not turning them into something larger, just allowing them to exist as they were, simple, true. She looked down briefly, her fingers brushing the chain at her neck, not out of habit anymore, not out of need, but as a quiet acknowledgement. The silver caught the faint light from the lamp behind her, glinting softly, no longer heavy, no longer tied to something she wished to forget. It had become something else entirely, something that marked a moment when she chose not to step back, when she chose to stand. And that meaning would not fade, no matter where the path ahead led. Ethan glanced at her then, just once, taking in the way she held herself, the steadiness that had replaced hesitation, the quiet strength that did not need to be announced. And he understood without asking that whatever came next, she would meet it the same way she had met everything here, without bending, without hiding. Clara lifted her gaze again, looking out across the darkened land. And for the first time since her story had begun to unravel, she did not feel like she was waiting for something to happen. She felt like she was already part of what was unfolding, part of something that would continue whether she feared it or not. And that made all the difference. The wind carried a faint sound in the distance. Nothing clear, nothing immediate, just the kind of movement that reminded you the world did not stop, that somewhere beyond the reach of sight, other paths crossed, other choices were being made. And Clara did not turn toward it, did not follow it with her eyes, because she did not need to know everything that lay ahead to move forward. She only needed to know that she would not step aside again. Ethan rested his hands lightly against the porch rail, the wood worn smooth beneath his palms, his posture relaxed, grounded, as if he had always belonged to this place and everything it held. And in a way, he had. But now, for the first time, Clara Whitmore felt that same sense of belonging. Not because the land had changed, not because the past had disappeared, but because she had claimed her place within it. And as the night deepened and the stars settled into their quiet patterns above, The story that had once been shaped by whispers and judgment no longer held the same power. It had not ended with a grand moment. No final declaration, no sudden shift that erased everything before it. It had ended the way most truths do, quietly, steadily, with a person choosing to stand where they are and remain there, no matter who might come or go. And out here, under a sky that kept no secrets, that was enough, more than enough, because in the end, what defined a person was not what others said when they thought no one was listening. It was what they chose to carry forward when the world finally grew quiet.